It was a morning like any other in the heart of the Congo Basin. Thick mist curling above the treetops, and the distant calls of colobus monkeys echoing like forgotten chants. Dr. Malik Saeed, a field researcher studying rare bird migration, wasn't looking for anything extraordinary that day. His path was the same one he had walked for weeks, down the worn trail behind Camp Ngolo, past the ancient fig tree the locals called Mwana Yampema, or Child of the Dawn. But fate has a strange way of revealing stories long hidden from the world. As Dr. Saeed crouched to examine a set of unusual bird tracks near the tree's twisted roots, his fingers brushed against something hard, metallic, cold, and entirely out of place. He pulled away the moss with care. There, half buried and rusted with age, was a small metal box, no larger than a shoebox, but sealed tight and oddly heavy. Intrigued, he carried it back to camp, brushing off years of dirt and decay with slow, deliberate strokes. The lock gave way after some coaxing. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and bundled with dried leaves, was a leather-bound diary. Its cover bore no name, just the faded initials, E.M. The pages inside had yellowed with time, the ink faded but legible, as though waiting for someone, anyone, to read them. The first page was dated June 12, 1975, and the first line read, "If someone finds this, I beg you not to tell my parents. They would never understand why I went back into the forest." Dr. Saeed would later say that he felt a chill then, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense that he was holding a story meant to stay hidden until now. What followed was no ordinary journal. It was the private account of a 12-year-old girl, one whose voice leapt off the page with vivid emotion and eerie clarity. As he flipped through entry after entry, reading about mysterious trails, strange dreams, and encounters with wild gorillas, Dr. Saeed realized he had found something far more valuable than data or research. He had found a forgotten truth, one buried not just by soil and time, but perhaps by those who didn't dare to believe. The diary belonged to a young girl named Elara M., a 12-year-old who had spent most of her life surrounded by the dense forests of the Congo Basin. Her parents were well-known British primatologists, studying gorillas in the wild, but Elara was different from most children who grew up in the shadow of scientific work. While other kids might have been content with playing in the safety of camp, Elara found her solace among the wild creatures of the jungle. From an early age, she seemed to have an innate understanding of the animals around her. While other researchers struggled to even get close to the gorillas, Elara was known to sit for hours in their midst, sketching them with delicate strokes in her notebook. Her fascination wasn't just with their size or their strength, it was their eyes, their intelligence, and their way of being that drew her in. Her parents, focused on their own research, didn't always notice how deeply Elara connected with the jungle. They were too absorbed in studying the behavior of the gorillas and documenting their movements to pay attention to their daughter's quiet bond with the forest. They would often scold her for wandering off into the jungle alone, warning her of the dangers that lurked beyond the safety of their camp. But Elara wasn't afraid. In fact, she felt more at home in the jungle than anywhere else. To her, the jungle wasn't just a place of danger, it was a place of understanding, a place where she could communicate without words, a place where the creatures seemed to recognize her in a way no one else could. In her diary, Elara spoke of her longing to be accepted by the gorillas she admired so much. She mentioned the awe she felt every time she saw them, particularly the silverback, a massive and wise figure she named Oranu. Oranu was different from the other gorillas. There was something about his calm demeanor, his watchful eyes, that drew her in like a magnet. Elara wrote about how, over time, she began to notice something extraordinary. The way Oranu would gaze at her, as though he were trying to understand her, just as much as she was trying to understand him. And it wasn't just Oranu. The more time she spent with the gorillas, the more she began to feel as though they were communicating with her in ways no one could explain. Her entries described strange sensations, a pull in her chest when they looked at her, a sense of peace when they were near. She wrote that it felt as if the gorillas understood her pain, her loneliness, and her desire to belong. They would watch her, and she would watch them, and for a brief moment, it was as if they shared the same heart. Despite the warnings of her parents and the occasional stern words from the other researchers, Elara continued to visit the gorillas in secret. She didn't care about the dangers. The jungle, with its sounds and smells, had become her sanctuary, and the gorillas were her companions. There was a deep, unspoken connection between them, a connection she couldn't explain, but one she knew existed with every fiber of her being. Elara's curiosity eventually led her deeper into the jungle, beyond the familiar paths she had walked with her parents. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip low, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Elara made a decision. She would go further into the wilderness, farther than she had ever dared to go before. With nothing but her sketchbook and a small satchel of supplies, she slipped away from the camp, her heart pounding with excitement. Her feet moved silently over the soft, damp earth as she followed the trail of a silverback, the one she had seen before. The tracks were fresh, and she couldn't help but follow them, each step bringing her closer to the jungle's mysterious heart. For hours, she wandered deeper into the jungle, the sounds of the camp fading behind her. The air grew thick with the scent of wet earth and the distant calls of birds. She didn't care about the time, the warnings, or the dangers that lurked in the dense foliage. She had to see them again. The gorillas. She had to understand them. As dusk fell, Elara reached a clearing. In the fading light, she saw him, Oranu. The silverback, majestic and strong, stood at the edge of the clearing, his powerful frame outlined by the darkening sky. He turned his head and locked eyes with her, and in that moment, Elara felt a surge of emotion. It was as though he had been waiting for her. She stood still, her breath catching in her throat, watching him. Oranu didn't approach, but neither did he retreat. They just stood there, facing each other, as if the world had paused. In the silence that followed, Elara reached into her satchel and pulled out a small notebook. She began to sketch him, her hand moving quickly, capturing his features with a reverence she had never shown for any other subject. For what felt like an eternity, they stayed there, locked in this strange, peaceful standoff. Elara didn't dare move, fearing that any sudden motion might break the spell that had fallen over them. She didn't need to speak, didn't need to make any noise. Somehow, in that moment, she knew they understood each other. After what seemed like hours, Oranu turned his back to her, leading the group of gorillas further into the jungle. Elara watched them disappear into the shadows, before slowly gathering her things and heading back to camp. The walk back felt different, quieter, almost as if the jungle itself had become part of her. But from that day forward, Elara's bond with Oranu and the other gorillas deepened. She returned every day, sometimes staying for hours, just observing them, learning their ways. And over time, the gorillas began to accept her more and more, acknowledging her presence with subtle gestures, curious glances, and the occasional grunt of approval. She had become a part of their world, unnoticed by her parents, unnoticed by anyone except the gorillas themselves. As the days turned into weeks, Elara's connection with the gorillas deepened in ways she couldn't explain. What began as simple observation soon transformed into something far more profound. It wasn't just that she could understand their movements or their calls, it was as though they could understand her as well. The first time it happened, Elara had been sitting quietly in the jungle, watching Oranu and the others. She hadn't made a sound, hadn't moved a muscle, and yet she felt a strange shift in the air. Oranu turned his head sharply, his eyes locking onto hers. It wasn't a look of suspicion or confusion. It was as if he was acknowledging her presence, truly seeing her for the first time. Elara held her breath, unsure of what to do, but then, without warning, she mimicked one of the calls she had heard the gorillas make earlier that day. It was a soft, guttural sound, like a low grunt, To her surprise, Oranu didn't flinch or retreat. Instead, he made a similar sound, and the rest of the group followed suit. Elara's heart raced. Could it be possible? Could she actually communicate with them? From that moment on, she began experimenting with the sounds the gorillas made: grunts, hoots, low growls, and the occasional roar. She would mimic their calls as best as she could, testing to see if they would respond. To her amazement, they did. Oranu would turn his head when she called out to him. A younger gorilla, curious and playful, would step closer, intrigued by her strange sounds. The group seemed to recognize her presence, not as an outsider, but as something different, something familiar. Over time, Elara's diary entries grew more detailed. She started recording the specific sounds she made and the responses she received. She discovered patterns in their communication, ways in which the gorillas expressed their moods, their intentions, even their warnings. A deep, throaty grunt meant danger was near. A soft, almost musical hum signaled contentment. And when Oranu made a particular low rumble, the rest of the gorillas would instantly gather, ready to move. But Elara wasn't content to simply mimic their sounds. She began to experiment with gestures, movements of her hands, her body language, hoping that somehow they would understand. She would raise her arms in a particular way, as if to signal peace, and to her surprise, the gorillas would often mirror her, standing upright and gazing at her with curious eyes. She learned that the gorillas were not just responding to her sounds, they were paying attention to her actions, her posture, and even the subtle shifts in her expression. In her diary, Elara wrote about one particularly remarkable moment. She had been sitting by the edge of a river when a young gorilla approached her, slowly and cautiously. For a moment, they simply watched each other. Then, without thinking, Elara made a sweeping gesture with her hand, as if inviting the gorilla to come closer. The young one hesitated for a moment, then took a few tentative steps forward. Elara's heart swelled with amazement. It was a silent exchange, but one that held more meaning than any words could. She began to realize that this wasn't just a one-sided connection. The gorillas were not simply tolerating her presence, they were engaging with her, communicating in ways she had never imagined. Their intelligence, their ability to understand, was far beyond what the outside world had ever credited them with. And as she spent more time with them, Elara began to feel something she had never felt before: a deep, unspoken bond. The gorillas had accepted her, not as a human, not as an outsider, but as one of their own. And in return, she found a sense of belonging she had never experienced with other people. The jungle, with its dangers and mysteries, no longer felt like an unknown world. It felt like home. As Elara spent more time with the gorillas, she began to notice something strange. There was a subtle but constant presence lurking in the background, watching, observing, but never fully revealing itself. The jungle, as much as it had become her sanctuary, was not without its dangers. The gorillas had their territory, but there were other forces at play in the shadows, forces Elara could only begin to understand. Her diary entries began to hint at this unsettling feeling. At first, it was just a strange sense of being watched. The rustling of leaves when no animal was around, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, far off in the distance. She would look around, but there was never anyone there. It was as if the jungle itself had become a living, breathing entity, aware of her every move. Then, one evening, while Elara was sitting with Oranu and his group, she noticed something even more disturbing. There was a figure in the trees, human, but moving silently through the branches. Elara's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the silhouette of a man. The figure was too distant to make out any details, but it was unmistakable. It was one of the local tribesmen, someone she had seen before near the village, though never close enough to speak with. Elara's first instinct was to ignore it, to tell herself it was just her imagination. But as the days passed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The gorillas, too, seemed on edge. Oranu, typically calm and serene, began to act more alert, his movements sharp and calculated. The younger gorillas stayed close to the group, and even the playful ones became more cautious, as if they, too, sensed the presence of someone, watching them. It wasn't long before Elara made a chilling discovery. One afternoon, while following a trail through the jungle, she stumbled upon a small clearing. There, in the center, she found strange markings carved into the bark of a tree, symbols she didn't recognize. They were crude, but unmistakable. Tribal markings. Her eyes widened in realization. The figures she had seen in the trees weren't just wandering. They were watching her, and they were marking the land, claiming it as their own. Her diary entries became more fragmented as she grappled with the fear that had begun to creep into her once peaceful world. She wrote of a secret tribe that seemed to protect the gorillas, an ancient group that had lived alongside them for generations, guarding the creatures from outsiders. Elara wasn't sure if they saw her as an ally or a threat, but she couldn't deny the eerie feeling that they were always close by, watching her every move. One evening, as Elara sat by the edge of a river, a whisper carried through the trees. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but as she focused, she realized it was a voice, a low, guttural tone, speaking words in a language she didn't understand. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. The sound faded as quickly as it had come. In her diary, Elara wrote that she had been approached by one of the tribe members shortly after hearing the strange voice. The man had spoken to her in broken English, warning her to stay away from the deep jungle, to avoid the areas marked with the strange symbols. He told her that the gorillas were sacred, and that there were those who would stop at nothing to protect them from harm. Elara didn't know whether to believe him, but the fear in his eyes told her that this wasn't just superstition. There were forces at work in the jungle, forces that Elara had only begun to understand. But despite the warnings, despite the fear that now seemed to haunt her every step, Elara couldn't turn back. The pull of the gorillas, of Oranu, was too strong. She had found something in the jungle, something that felt more real, more true, than anything she had ever known. And no matter the dangers, no matter the shadowy figures lurking in the trees, she knew she couldn't abandon them. The gorillas needed her, and she needed them. As the days grew longer, Elara found herself torn between the safety of camp and the magnetic pull of the jungle. The warnings from the tribesmen and the ever-present shadow of the unknown forces lurking in the trees weighed heavily on her. But the bond she had formed with the gorillas, particularly with Oranu, was something she couldn't walk away from. She felt as though she had become a part of their world. They no longer regarded her as an outsider. The gorillas would approach her without hesitation, their eyes full of recognition. Oranu, the mighty Silverback, had even begun to show signs of trust that Elara couldn't ignore. He would sit near her for hours, watching her with a quiet intensity, as if to protect her from the dangers of the forest. It wasn't just a bond of curiosity anymore, it was a connection that felt like family. But it wasn't just the gorillas she had to worry about. There was something else at play, something darker. As she ventured deeper into the jungle, Elara began to notice that the tribe's presence was growing more pronounced. The markings on the trees became more frequent, more elaborate, and the whispers in the wind, the low voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand, started to follow her wherever she went. She could feel their eyes on her, watching from the trees, from the shadows. She knew they were trying to protect the gorillas, but in their eyes, she wasn't one of them. She was still an outsider, someone who didn't belong. One afternoon, while sitting in the clearing near the river, Elara had a realization. She wasn't just observing the gorillas anymore, she was living among them. She had learned their ways, understood their calls, their gestures, and their movements. But there was still something deeper, something she hadn't yet discovered. The question lingered in her mind. Was there more to their communication than just sounds and gestures? Were the gorillas trying to tell her something that went beyond what she could see? Her mind raced with possibilities as she observed Oranu. He was watching her again, but this time his gaze held something different. A silent invitation. Elara stood up, feeling an overwhelming urge to follow him. Without a word, she moved toward him, and he slowly turned and began to lead her deeper into the jungle, further than she had ever gone before. The path grew narrower, the trees thicker, as if the jungle itself was closing in on her. Elara followed closely behind Oranu, feeling a sense of both awe and trepidation. She had never been this far from the safety of the camp, and the air felt heavier, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. The gorillas were moving silently now, a few steps ahead of her, as if they were guiding her to something important. After what felt like hours, they came to a stop in a secluded part of the jungle, a place Elara had never seen before. It was a clearing, but it was different from the others she had visited. The air was still, almost sacred. The ground was covered with lush ferns and thick vines, and in the center of the clearing was a large rock formation, ancient and worn by time. It was unlike any other structure Elara had ever encountered in the jungle. Oranu approached the rock and stopped, his massive form standing still as if in reverence. Elara felt an intense pull toward it, an overwhelming sense that something important had brought her here. She stepped forward, her heart racing, and as she reached out to touch the surface of the rock, a strange sensation washed over her, a surge of energy, as though the earth itself was speaking to her. It was then that she understood. This was no ordinary place. This was a sacred site, an ancient meeting ground of the gorillas, a place where they gathered for rituals and communication beyond the physical realm. Elara had unknowingly stumbled upon something that the gorillas had protected for generations. It was a place of deep significance, one that connected the gorillas to the earth in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. As she stood there, absorbing the gravity of the moment, Elara realized that she was no longer just an observer. She had become a part of something much larger than herself. The gorillas, Oranu, and the jungle had welcomed her into their fold. And with that understanding came a new responsibility. She wasn't just protecting them anymore. She was a guardian of the jungle, of its secrets, and of its ancient ways. The tribe, the watchers in the trees, had been right all along. Elara wasn't meant to be a passive observer. She was meant to help protect the gorillas and the sacred bond they shared with the jungle. The gorillas had shown her their world, and in return, she had to help safeguard it from the dangers that lurked in the shadows. Her diary entries from that day were filled with wonder and awe, but they also carried a sense of urgency. Elara knew that the balance between the gorillas, the tribe, and the outside world was fragile. She had uncovered a truth that many were too afraid to accept. The gorillas were not just animals. They were a key to something far greater, something ancient and powerful that the world was just beginning to understand.